Good evening, friends, and welcome back to another gentle journey through history. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into the world of Native American traditions, not the dramatic battles or sweeping conflicts you might expect, but the quiet, everyday moments that shaped entire cultures. The rituals around fire, the careful preparation of food, the soft passing of stories from elder to child under star-filled skies. Before we begin, I have two small questions for you. Where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're tucked into bed in a quiet suburb, or maybe you're on the other side of the world, resting after a long day. And what time is it in your part of the world right now? Early evening? The deep hours past midnight? Wherever you are, whatever the hour, you're exactly where you need to be. Now, let's prepare your space together. Dim your lights, or turn them off completely if you prefer. Rest your head gently on your pillow. Adjust it just so, until your neck feels perfectly cradled. Pull your blanket up to that sweet spot, just beneath your chin or draped loosely over your shoulder. Allow your breathing to soften. There's no rush tonight. There's nowhere else to be. Just you, this story, and the quiet comfort of history unfolding like a warm quilt around you. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind, if you find yourself drifting off into restful sleep, feel free to tap the like button and subscribe to the channel. But only if it feels right to you. No pressure. Just an invitation to join us again whenever you need another gentle escape into the past. And now, let's begin. Imagine, if you will, a small clearing in what we now call the northeastern woodlands of North America. It's late autumn, sometime around the year 1200, though exact dates blur softly into the mist of memory. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in shades of dusky purple and fading orange. The air smells of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of roasting corn. A woman, let's call her Gentle Rain, though names in this time were far more fluid than our modern conventions, kneels beside a small fire. She's adding kindling with slow, deliberate movements. Each twig is placed with intention. This isn't simply starting a fire in the way we might flick on a gas stove or strike a match. This is a ritual. The fire is a living thing, a companion, a source of warmth and story. Among the Haudenosaunee people, whom Europeans would later call the Iroquois, fire was honored as a gift from the Sky Woman herself. Gentle Rain reaches into a woven basket beside her and pulls out 3 dried ears of corn. Now, you might think of corn as something you butter up at a summer barbecue, or pop in the microwave for a quick snack. But for the peoples of the eastern woodlands, corn, or maize, as it was originally known, was sacred. It was one of the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a harmony that enriched the soil and sustained entire communities. She carefully removes the kernels from one ear, the soft pop-pop-pop of seeds releasing into a clay bowl, creating a rhythm almost like rainfall. Some of these kernels will be ground into flour. Some will be boiled into a thick, hearty porridge. And some, my personal favorite, will be mixed with maple syrup and formed into small cakes, then toasted over the fire until they're golden and slightly crispy on the outside, soft and sweet within. Imagine that taste. The earthiness of corn meeting the deep, caramel notes of pure maple syrup, Nothing artificial, nothing rushed. Just two ingredients that grew within walking distance of this very fire. Here's a small detail you might find soothingly interesting. The process of making maple syrup was discovered, according to Anishinaabe oral tradition, by accident. A woman was preparing a meal and used sap from a maple tree instead of water to boil her venison. The result was so unexpectedly delicious that it became a tradition, passed down through generations. By the 1700s, native communities were producing thousands of pounds of maple sugar each spring, a practice that European settlers would later adopt and commercialize. Gentle rain sets the corn aside and reaches for a strip of dried venison. This is the savory anchor of tonight's meal. The meat has been smoked slowly over green wood for days, giving it a deep, rich flavor that needs no seasoning beyond time and patience. She'll soften it in a broth made from bones, wild onions, and herbs gathered from the forest floor. The Lenape people who lived in the region we now call Delaware and New Jersey perfected the art of preserving meat through smoking and drying, a technique that allowed them to survive harsh winters without refrigeration, without modern conveniences, relying entirely on knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. As the fire settles into a steady glow, Gentle Rain's daughter, maybe 10 years old, with curious eyes and hands that can't quite stay still, joins her mother by the flames. She's carrying something wrapped in large leaves. "I found mushrooms," she says proudly, unwrapping 3 pale, bulbous fungi that her mother inspects with the careful eye of someone who knows which mushrooms nourish and which ones send you on a journey you didn't ask for. "Puffballs," her mother confirms with a gentle smile. "Good work." Now, puffballs might sound like something from a children's fairy tale, but they were, and still are, a delicacy. When sliced thin and cooked over an open flame, they develop a texture remarkably similar to tofu, absorbing whatever flavors surround them. They're mild, slightly nutty, and here's the unusual part. If you let them mature fully, they fill with spores that explode in a smoky cloud when touched. Children in many tribes would find dried puffballs and stomp on them for entertainment, releasing clouds of brown smoke that would drift away on the breeze. Nature's little joke. A quiet delight in a world without television or smartphones. The two of them work in companionable silence, the kind of silence that's actually filled with small sounds, the crackle of the fire, the distant call of an owl beginning its evening hunt, the rustle of leaves as a breeze moves through the surrounding trees. This is what I find so comforting about these moments in history. There's no hurry, no notifications, no pressure to be anywhere other than exactly where you are. Gentle Rain begins to tell her daughter a story, not a grand epic, but a small teaching tale about the importance of gratitude. Among many native communities, particularly the Haudenosaunee, every meal began with a Thanksgiving address. Not a quick grace, muttered before digging in, but a genuine acknowledgement of every element that made the meal possible. Thanks to the corn for growing strong. Thanks to the rain for nourishing the earth. Thanks to the sun for its warmth. Thanks to the deer for offering its life. Thanks to the mushrooms for appearing at just the right time. This practice wasn't rooted in religion in the way we typically think of it. There were no churches, no written scriptures. Instead, it was a recognition of interconnection, a reminder that nothing exists in isolation, that every meal is a gift from a web of relationships stretching back through time and outward through the forest. As the corn cakes begin to toast, releasing their sweet aroma into the cooling evening air, Gentle Rain's husband returns from checking the fish traps along the nearby stream. He carries 2 fat trout, their scales catching the firelight like tiny mirrors. Fish was another staple, particularly among the coastal tribes and those living near rivers and lakes. The Chinook people of the Pacific Northwest developed elaborate systems for catching and preserving salmon, so much so that by the late 1800s, they were managing fish populations more sustainably than many modern commercial operations. The trout will be wrapped in wet clay and buried in the coals of the fire, a cooking method that steams the fish from the inside while keeping all its moisture intact. When you crack open that clay shell, carefully so you don't burn your fingers, the skin peels away and the flesh inside is tender, flaky, perfect. It's a technique that requires no pots, no pans, no fancy equipment. Just clay, fire, and patience. There's something almost magical about this scene, isn't there? A family gathered around a fire, preparing food with their hands, sharing stories that have been told for generations. No one is rushing. No one is checking the time. The rhythm of the evening is set by the fire itself, by the darkening sky, by the natural cycle of hunger and satisfaction. By the time the meal is ready, corn cakes, venison broth, roasted puffballs, and steamed trout, the stars have begun to appear overhead. The family eats slowly, savoring each bite, each moment. And when they're finished, they don't immediately clean up and move on to the next task. They sit. They watch the fire. They let the warmth seep into their bones. This, I think, is one of the great lessons of Native American traditions, not the big, dramatic moments that make it into history books, but these quiet, repeated rituals. The understanding that life is not a race to be won, but a series of moments to be fully inhabited. That the act of preparing food, of gathering around a fire, of telling stories, is not a means to an end. It is the end. That is the point. As your own body begins to relax deeper into your bed, as your breathing slows and your thoughts start to drift like smoke on a breeze, allow yourself to feel that same sense of presence. You don't need to be anywhere else. You don't need to do anything else. Just be here, in this moment, listening to this story, feeling the weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, the gentle pull of sleep beginning to tug at the edges of your consciousness. And now, allow your mind to float gently into the next chapter. The longhouse stands like a great wooden ship in the center of the village, its rounded roof arching overhead, its walls made from sheets of bark carefully stripped from elm trees and bound to a frame of bent saplings. Inside, it's surprisingly warm despite the late autumn chill outside. Smoke from several small fires drifts upward toward openings in the roof, carrying with it the scent of cooking food and burning cedar. We're still with the Haudenosaunee people, but we've moved forward in time slightly, let's say around 1450, and shifted our focus to the interior life of the community. A longhouse wasn't just a building, it was a living representation of the clan structure itself. Multiple families, all related through the maternal line, shared this space. Imagine that. Not individual houses with locked doors and privacy fences, but a communal dwelling where your grandmother, your aunts, your cousins, and your mother's sisters all lived under one roof. Where children were raised collectively, where decisions were made by consensus, where the concept of mine versus yours applied far less to space and far more to personal items like tools or clothing. An elderly woman, we'll call her Still Waters, sits near one of the central fires, grinding dried blueberries into a fine powder. These aren't fresh berries, plump and juicy, ready to burst in your mouth. These were harvested months ago, during the brief summer abundance, then dried in the sun until they shriveled into small, intensely flavored nuggets of sweetness. Now, ground into powder, they'll be mixed with rendered bear fat and formed into small cakes that can be stored for months. Pemmican, essentially, a native superfood long before anyone used the word superfood. Bear fat might sound unusual to modern ears, but think of it like butter or olive oil, a rich, flavorful fat that made food more satisfying and helped people survive cold winters when calories were precious. And the taste? Surprisingly mild, slightly sweet, with none of the gamey flavor you might expect. Mixed with blueberry powder, it becomes something like a very rustic cheesecake filling, dense and rich and just sweet enough to satisfy. Still Waters hums softly as she works, a melody without words, passed down from her grandmother. This is another element I find deeply comforting, the way music and rhythm were woven into everyday tasks. Grinding corn, pounding bark to make rope, weaving baskets. These weren't silent, tedious chores. They were opportunities for song, for meditation, for connecting with the generations of women who had done the same work in the same way. Near the back of the longhouse, a group of children are playing a game with small sticks and a bundle of dried corn husks. The rules are complex in that way children's games often are, full of exceptions and special cases that only make sense if you've been playing since you were old enough to toddle. But the joy is universal. The squeals of laughter when someone wins. The good-natured arguments about whether a move was legal. The way they tumble over each other like puppies, all elbows and knees and boundless energy. One of the children, a boy of maybe 7 or 8, breaks away from the game and approaches Still Waters. "Grandmother," he says, using the term of respect applied to all elderly women regardless of actual blood relation, "tell us about the peacemaker." This is a common request. The story of the peacemaker, the figure who united the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy sometime between 1100 and 1500, oral histories vary on the exact date, is one of the foundational narratives of the culture. But Still Waters doesn't launch into an epic recitation. Instead, she reaches into a basket beside her and pulls out a strip of smoked eel. "Are you hungry?" she asks. The boy nods eagerly. She tears off a piece and hands it to him. "Eat first. Stories are best on a full belly." Smoked eel might be the most unusual food item we've encountered so far. It's oily, rich, with a flavor somewhere between salmon and nothing else quite compares. Eel was a prized food among many eastern tribes, particularly those near water. The Wampanoag people of what's now Massachusetts held eel in such high regard that they would trade other goods to secure a good supply. By the 1600s, when European settlers arrived, they were initially horrified by the idea of eating eel, until they tried it. Then it became a staple of colonial diets as well. Funny how that works. As the boy chews thoughtfully, Still Waters begins her story, but not in the way you might expect. She doesn't start with "once upon a time" or "long ago in a distant land." Instead, she begins with a question. What do you think makes a person powerful? The boy swallows his mouthful of eel and considers. Strong muscles? Good aim with a bow. Still Waters smiles. Those things can help, but the peacemaker's power came from his words, from his ability to see what connected people rather than what divided them. This is the heart of the great law of peace, the Constitution that governed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and yes, Constitution is the right word. Some historians argue that this system of government, with its emphasis on checks and balances, representation, and consensus building, influenced the framers of the United States Constitution centuries later. Benjamin Franklin, in particular, was known to have studied the Haudenosaunee model. Whether the influence was direct or indirect is still debated, but the sophistication of the system itself is undeniable. Still Waters continues, her voice soft and steady, explaining how the peacemaker traveled from village to village, convincing warring tribes to set aside their grievances and unite under a common set of principles. Not through force, not through conquest, but through patient dialogue, through appeals to shared humanity, through the recognition that peace was more sustainable than endless cycles of revenge. By now, several other children have drifted over, drawn by the sound of the story. They settle on the floor around Still Waters like petals around the center of a flower. She reaches into another basket and produces a handful of roasted chestnuts. A savory treat, warm and slightly sweet, with a texture that's soft but not mushy. Chestnuts were abundant in the eastern forests before a blight wiped out most of the American chestnut trees in the early 1900s. But in this time period, in this longhouse, they're as common as popcorn. She passes the chestnuts around, and the children crack them open with their teeth, the soft pop of shells breaking adding a gentle percussion to the story. This is another aspect of these traditions that I find so soothing, the way food and story and community are completely intertwined. You're never just eating. You're never just listening. You're doing both together in a space where both are equally important. As Still Waters talks about the symbolic tree of peace, a great white pine under which weapons were buried, its roots spreading in the four directions to represent the reach of peace, one of the children falls asleep, their head resting on an older sister's lap. No one wakes them. No one shoos them off to a separate room. They simply adjust their positions slightly to make the sleeping child more comfortable, and the story continues. This casual acceptance of sleep, of rest, of the body's natural rhythms, is something we've lost in modern life. We fight sleep. We see it as an inconvenience, something to be optimized and hacked and gotten through as quickly as possible so we can get back to productive activities. But in the longhouse, sleep is just another part of the cycle. If you're tired, you sleep. If you're hungry, you eat. If you need to be alone, you step outside for a while. There's no judgment, no pressure, just a gentle accommodation of human needs. Still Waters finishes her story not with a dramatic climax, but with a quiet reflection. The peacemaker taught us that the strongest tree is not the one that stands alone, but the one whose roots are intertwined with others. That's why we live like this, together, sharing space and food and stories. Because alone we might survive, but together we thrive. The fire has burned down to coals now, glowing softly in the dimness of the longhouse. Outside, the wind has picked up, rustling the bark walls slightly, but inside it's still warm, still safe. Someone adds a log to the fire, and sparks dance upward toward the smoke hole, tiny stars climbing toward the real ones beyond. As you listen to this story, as you feel your own eyelids growing heavier, notice how your body has begun to mirror that sense of safety. Your shoulders have dropped. Your jaw has unclenched. Your breath has deepened. You're not forcing any of this. It's simply happening, naturally, the way sleep should come, not as something you chase, but as something you allow. And as the children in the longhouse drift off one by one, and as still Waters finally sets aside her grinding stone and pulls a woven blanket over her lap, let's drift together into the next chapter. Dawn comes slowly to the village, the sky shifting from deep indigo to soft gray to the palest pink. Birdsong begins as a single note, one brave robin announcing the arrival of light, then builds into a chorus as sparrows, chickadees, and jays join in. Inside the longhouse, people stir gradually, no alarm clocks or harsh buzzing to jolt them into consciousness. Just the gentle return of awareness, the slow recognition that a new day has begun. We're moving forward in time again, now to around 1610, and shifting our focus to the green corn ceremony, a tradition practiced by numerous southeastern tribes, including the Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole peoples. This isn't a single morning, but rather the beginning of a multi-day celebration that marks the ripening of the first corn, the renewal of the community, and the forgiveness of old grievances. A young man, let's call him Swift Fox, wakes before most of the others. He's been chosen to help prepare the ceremonial grounds, and he takes this responsibility seriously. He steps outside into the air so fresh and cool it almost stings his lungs. Dew has settled on everything, turning spider webs into strings of jewels and making the grass glisten like it's been dusted with diamond powder. His first task is to help rekindle the sacred fire. The old fire has been allowed to die completely, a symbolic act representing the end of the old year and all its accumulated troubles. The new fire will be started from scratch, using a bow drill and dried tinder, and from this fire all the household fires in the village will be relit. It's a powerful metaphor, isn't it? The idea that you can start fresh, that the mistakes and hurts of the past year don't have to be carried forward indefinitely, that renewal is always possible. Swift Fox works patiently with the bow drill, the rhythmic sawing motion creating friction, heat, smoke, and finally a tiny ember glowing in the tinder nest. He lifts it carefully, blows on it gently, not too hard, just enough to give it oxygen, and watches as it blooms into flame. There's a quiet satisfaction in this act, in creating fire from wood and effort and breath. No matches, No lighters. Just knowledge and skill passed down through generations. As the fire grows, other members of the community begin to gather. An elderly woman brings a bundle of dried sage and sweetgrass, which she adds to the flames. The smoke that rises is thick and fragrant, used to cleanse both the physical space and the spiritual atmosphere. You might recognize this practice. Smudging has become popular in mainstream culture in recent years, though it's worth noting that for Native communities, it's not a trendy wellness practice but a sacred ritual with deep roots. Now, let's talk about the food at the center of this ceremony. The star, of course, is corn, but not just any corn. The first ears of the season, picked when they've reached just the right level of ripeness. These ears are roasted over the sacred fire, the kernels popping slightly, the natural sugars caramelizing. The smell is incredible, sweet, smoky, with an earthy depth that's hard to describe if you've never experienced it. But here's something you might not expect. Before anyone is allowed to eat this new corn, there's a purification ritual. For several days leading up to the ceremony, participants fast or eat only very specific foods. Some communities required men to drink a ceremonial tea made from the Yupon holly plant, a tea so caffeinated and, frankly, so bitter that it would make you purge everything from your system. Unpleasant? Absolutely. But it was believed to cleanse the body and prepare it to receive the blessing of the new crop. By comparison, the actual feast feels like the greatest luxury imaginable. After days of deprivation, that first bite of fresh corn is transcendent. Your taste buds, heightened by the fast, pick up every nuance of flavor. And it's not just corn. There's also safki, a thin gruel made from corn that's been treated with wood ash, a process called nixtamalization, which unlocks nutrients and makes the corn more digestible, sweetened with honey and sometimes flavored with berries. Speaking of honey, here's our sweet component for this chapter. Native peoples in the Southeast were expert foragers, and wild honey was a prized treat. Unlike the clover honey you might buy at a grocery store, wild honey varied dramatically depending on what flowers the bees had visited. Sourwood honey, made from the nectar of sourwood tree blossoms, has a delicate, almost caramel-like flavor with a hint of anise. Tupelo honey, from the white Ogeechee tupelo trees that grow in swamps, is so prized that it's still harvested commercially today, fetching premium prices. Native foragers would track bees back to their hives, carefully smoking them out, and harvest the honey without destroying the colony, sustainable beekeeping centuries before the term existed. Swift Fox, having completed his fire-starting duties, joins a group of men preparing the savory portion of the feast. They're roasting a wild turkey, not the domesticated, broad-breasted birds you see at Thanksgiving, but a lean, athletic wild bird that could fly and run with impressive speed. The flavor is darker, richer, more complex than domestic turkey. The meat is denser, requiring slower cooking, but the result is worth the patience. The turkey is stuffed with wild rice, pecans, and dried persimmons, a combination that might sound unusual but works beautifully. The wild rice, technically not rice at all, but a grass seed, adds a nutty, chewy texture. The pecans, native to North America and used by tribes for thousands of years, provide richness and healthy fats. And the persimmons, dried until their sugars concentrate, offer pockets of intense sweetness that balance the savory elements. Here's a small historical note that might interest you. Pecans were so important to the Algonquin peoples that the word pecan comes from their language, referring to all nuts requiring a stone to crack. By the 1700s, pecans had become a trade commodity, with native tribes exchanging them with European settlers for metal tools and cloth. As the preparations continue, Swift Fox's grandmother approaches him with a bowl containing what looks like small, dark, wrinkled fruits. "Taste," she says, offering him one. He pops it into his mouth and his face immediately contorts. It's a haw, the fruit of the hawthorn tree, and it's intensely tart, almost astringent, with a flavor that makes your mouth pucker and your eyes water. But there's also something compelling about it, a sourness that's refreshing in its intensity. His grandmother laughs at his expression. The first time is always a surprise. But watch, eat 3 more, slowly. He does, and by the 4th one, his palate has adjusted. He's starting to pick up on the subtle sweetness beneath the tartness, the floral notes that emerge once the initial shock fades. Haws were often used medicinally, believed to strengthen the heart and aid digestion, but they were also eaten fresh, dried, or made into jams and preserves. This, I think, is our unusual food for this chapter, something that challenges the palate, that requires you to adjust your expectations, that rewards persistence with unexpected complexity. Not everything worth having comes easily or tastes immediately pleasant. As the sun climbs higher and the ceremonial fire burns steadily, the mood in the gathering space becomes increasingly joyful. People are laughing, embracing, sharing stories about the year that's passed. And here's the most beautiful part. During the green corn ceremony, grudges were officially forgiven. If you'd had a dispute with someone, if they'd wronged you or you'd wronged them, this was the time to let it go. Not to rug sweep or pretend it hadn't happened, but to consciously release it and move forward unburdened. Can you imagine how freeing that must have felt? To know that once a year, there was a designated time to exhale all the accumulated resentments and start fresh? We could use more of that in modern life, I think. More ceremonial letting go. More communal forgiveness. The feast, when it finally begins, lasts for hours. There's no sense of hurry, no need to eat quickly and move on to the next thing. People serve themselves small portions, eat slowly, go back for seconds or thirds as their appetite dictates. Children run between the adults, stealing bites from various bowls, their faces sticky with honey and corn juice. Swift Fox finds himself sitting between his grandmother and a young woman from a neighboring clan. They don't talk much, just sit together in comfortable companionship, watching the fire, feeling the warmth of the sun, tasting the newness of the season. There's a contentment in this moment that doesn't require words. A sense that everything necessary is present, that nothing is lacking. As the afternoon wears on and people begin to drift into that pleasant, full-bellied drowsiness that follows a good meal, the elder who oversees the ceremony stands and offers a blessing. It's not a prayer to a distant deity, but a direct address to the corn itself, thanking it for returning once again, for offering its life to sustain the community. There's a reciprocity in this relationship. The people plant and tend the corn, and the corn nourishes the people. Both give, both receive. Your own breathing has probably slowed even more by now. Your body feels heavier against your mattress, like you're sinking gently into a cloud. That's good. That's exactly right. Let yourself sink. Let yourself release whatever small tensions you've been holding. And as the ceremonial fire burns down to coals and the community settles into the warm afternoon, let's drift together into the next chapter. Winter has settled over the land now, and we've traveled west to the high desert of what's now called the Four Corners region, where the ancestral Puebloans built their remarkable cliff dwellings. The year is approximately 1200, and we're inside one of these dwellings, not a massive multi-story complex, but a smaller family unit carved into the protective face of a sandstone cliff. The architecture itself is fascinating. The builders chose these locations carefully, south-facing cliffs that caught the winter sun, providing passive solar heating, while the overhang protected against summer's harsh rays. The walls are made of sandstone blocks fitted together with mud mortar. The interior space is small and cave-like, retaining warmth with remarkable efficiency. Inside, a small fire burns in a central pit, its smoke venting through a hole in the roof. A woman, we'll call her Painted Sky, sits on a woven mat, working on a basket. But this isn't casual basket weaving. This is an art form so refined that some ancestral Puebloan baskets, over 800 years old, are still intact and watertight today, displayed in museums, their geometric patterns as crisp as the day they were completed. The basket she's working on is made from willow shoots, soaked until pliable, then woven in a coiling technique that creates a tight, spiral pattern. Her fingers move with practiced ease, barely looking at the work, while her daughter sits beside her, attempting her first basket under her mother's patient guidance. "Not so tight," Painted Sky murmurs. "The willow needs room to settle as it dries." The daughter, maybe 12 years old, at that awkward age between childhood and whatever comes next, loosens her grip slightly. Her basket is lumpy where her mother's is smooth, the pattern irregular, but there's determination in her face. She's learning not just a skill, but a tradition, a way of thinking about materials and patience and the relationship between intention and outcome. Let's talk about the foods of this desert region, because they're quite different from the forest and river foods we've encountered so far. For sweetness, there's the fruit of the prickly pear cactus, those vibrant magenta petals covered in spines. When carefully peeled, and I do mean carefully, those tiny glochids, the hair-like spines, are worse than the large ones. The fruit inside is intensely sweet, with a flavor like watermelon crossed with strawberry, and a texture full of small, crunchy seeds. Prickly pear fruit was harvested in late summer and early fall, eaten fresh, or dried into leather-like sheets that could be stored through winter and rehydrated as needed. By the 1800s, Spanish missionaries in the Southwest were using prickly pear to make wine and syrup, having learned the techniques from native peoples who'd been utilizing the plant for thousands of years. Painted Sky has a small pot simmering at the edge of the fire. Inside is a stew made from dried rabbit, hominy, corn treated with lime water to remove the hulls, and a handful of piña nuts. This is our savory element, a stew that's been simmering slowly for hours, the flavors melding into something far greater than the sum of its parts. Pinyon nuts, harvested from pinyon pine trees, are rich, buttery, and surprisingly filling. They're packed with protein and healthy fats, making them an essential winter food. Gathering them was, and still is, a community activity. When the cones ripened, families would head into the forests with long poles, knocking cones from high branches, then roasting them to make the nuts easier to extract. A good harvest meant the difference between a comfortable winter and a hungry one. The daughter sets her basket aside and stirs the stew, inhaling deeply. "I love this smell," she says. Painted Sky smiles. "Your grandmother used to make this stew. And her grandmother before her. The recipe is older than any of us can count." This is something I find deeply comforting, the idea that a flavor, a specific combination of ingredients, can connect you across generations. When you taste that stew, you're tasting something your ancestors tasted, experiencing a sensory link that transcends time. For our unusual food in this chapter, I want to tell you about roasted grasshoppers. Yes, grasshoppers. Before you recall, consider this. Grasshoppers are eaten by over 2 billion people worldwide today. They're high in protein, low in fat, and when roasted until crispy, they have a nutty, almost popcorn-like flavor. Many native peoples of the Southwest would conduct communal grasshopper drives, using fire and smoke to herd swarms of the insects into pits lined with coals, where they'd be roasted en masse. Were they a preferred food? Probably not. But they were a reliable food, appearing predictably, requiring no hunting or cultivation, just timing and cooperation. And in a desert environment where resources could be scarce, reliability mattered more than preference. As the evening deepens, Painted Sky's husband returns from checking the hunting snares he'd set earlier. He's empty-handed, but not discouraged. Hunting in winter is always uncertain. That's why the dried foods, the stored grains, the preserves made during abundance, these are what sustain the community through lean times. He settles by the fire and accepts a bowl of stew, blowing on it to cool it before taking a careful sip. "Good," he says simply, and that single word contains volumes of appreciation. After the meal, Painted Sky brings out a small leather pouch and carefully extracts a handful of tiny, dark seeds. These are chia seeds. Yes, the same ones that became a health food trend in the 2010s. But long before chia pudding appeared in trendy cafes, the ancestral Puebloans and other southwestern tribes were cultivating and utilizing chia seeds as a high-energy food source. She mixes the seeds with a little water, forming a gel, then adds a spoonful of honey and a pinch of juniper ash for flavor. The result is something like a very rustic tapioca pudding. Slightly gritty, mildly sweet, and oddly satisfying. Each person gets just a small spoonful, enough to taste the treat but not so much that it depletes the winter stores. As they eat, the daughter asks her father to tell a story. He considers for a moment, then begins to speak about the migrations, the long journeys their ancestors made across the landscape, following water, following game, following the subtle signs that indicated where food would grow and where communities could thrive. This is a quieter kind of story than the dramatic conflict narratives we often associate with history. It's a story about paying attention, about noticing which plants grew near water sources, about understanding that certain animals migrated in predictable patterns, about the slow accumulation of knowledge that allowed people to survive in environments that seem, to modern eyes, impossibly harsh. The cliff dwelling itself is part of this knowledge system. The ancestral Puebloans didn't build here randomly. They understood solar angles, thermal mass, wind patterns. They knew that this specific overhang would protect against both summer sun and winter storms, that the sandstone would absorb heat during the day and radiate it back at night, that the elevation would provide defense while the spring below ensured water. When Europeans first encountered these cliff dwellings in the late 1800s, they assumed they'd been built as fortresses, defensive positions against enemies. But archaeological evidence suggests the reality was more complex. Yes, the locations offered some protection, but they also offered efficiency, sustainability, and a deep integration with the landscape. The daughter, listening to her father's story, has resumed working on her basket. Her movements are more confident now, the rhythm of weaving becoming meditative. This is another aspect of these winter nights I find soothing, the way hands stay busy while the mind drifts, the way repetitive motion creates a kind of moving meditation. Painted Sky stands and moves to the back of the dwelling, where pottery vessels are stacked neatly. She selects one, a beautiful piece with black geometric designs painted on a white slip, and brings it to the fire. Inside are dried apricots, traded from a neighboring tribe that had access to the fruit. Apricots aren't native to North America, but by the 1600s, Spanish colonizers had introduced them, and they spread through trade networks faster than the colonizers themselves. But in this time period, 1200, the dried fruit would more likely be yucca fruit or wild plums, both sweet, both dense with sugar when dried, both a precious treat during the long winter months. Painted Sky passes the vessel around, each person taking one piece of fruit, rolling it between their fingers to soften it slightly before eating. The fire has burned down to coals again, glowing red and orange in the darkness. Outside, the wind whistles softly through the canyon, not threatening, just present, a reminder of the world beyond the warm shelter. Stars are visible through the smoke hole, bright and sharp in the clear desert air. The daughter finishes her section of basket and holds it up for inspection. It's still imperfect, but there's improvement visible from beginning to end. A learning curve captured in willow and patience. Good, Painted Sky says, echoing her husband's earlier assessment. And again, that single word carries weight, not effusive praise, but genuine acknowledgement. As the family settles in for sleep, rolling out woven mats and pulling rabbit fur blankets over themselves, there's a sense of completion to the day. Work was done. Food was shared. Stories were told. Knowledge was passed on. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make it into a history book. Just life, lived fully, in harmony with the constraints and gifts of the environment. Your own eyes are probably very heavy now. Your thoughts are probably becoming dreamlike, less linear, more fluid. That's perfect. That's exactly where we want to be. And as this desert family drifts into sleep, secure in their cliff dwelling, let's drift together into the next chapter. We've traveled far now, all the way to the Pacific Northwest, to the land of the Coast Salish peoples. The year is approximately 1750, and we're standing on the bank of a wide river as the first salmon of the season begin their return from the ocean. This moment, the salmon run, is so central to the culture and economy of this region that entire calendars were organized around it. A young woman, let's call her Morning Mist, stands knee-deep in the cold water, a spear poised in her hands. She's been waiting motionless for several minutes now, her eyes scanning the current for movement. Salmon fishing requires patience, timing, and a deep understanding of the fish's behavior. You can't force it. You have to wait for the right moment, then act decisively. There, a flash of silver beneath the surface. Her arm moves in a blur, the spear piercing the water, and when she lifts it, a large salmon rides on the end, its scales catching the morning light like liquid metal. It's a clean catch, quick and humane, the result of years of practice that began when she was barely old enough to walk. She carries the salmon to shore, where an elderly woman, the fish chief, responsible for overseeing the harvest and ensuring its sustainability, inspects it and nods approval. This first salmon of the season will be treated with a special ceremony. It's not just food. It's a gift, a promise, a renewal of the relationship between the people and the salmon that has sustained them for thousands of years. The fish is carefully prepared, gutted, cleaned, and roasted whole on cedar planks positioned near a smoky fire. The smell is incredible, rich, oily, smoky, with the sweet tang of cedar infusing the flesh. Salmon is naturally fatty, especially the salmon from this region, and that fat carries flavor in a way that lean fish simply can't match. Here's a historical detail you might find interesting. By the mid-1800s, the Columbia River salmon runs were so abundant that estimates put the annual return at 10 to 16 million fish. The fish were so plentiful that they were described as creating pavement in the rivers, so densely packed you could theoretically walk across their backs. Of course, by the early 1900s, overfishing, habitat destruction, and dam construction had decimated the runs, a tragedy of the commons that native peoples had been warning about, having managed these fish populations sustainably for millennia. But this time, in this place, the salmon still return in abundance. And the people honor that abundance with gratitude and restraint. They take what they need. They preserve carefully. They waste nothing. Morning Mist participates in the first salmon ceremony, where the fish is shared among all members of the community, each person receiving a small piece. After everyone has eaten, the bones are carefully collected, every single one, and returned to the river. This isn't superstition. It's a ritual acknowledgement that the salmon spirit must return to the water to be reborn, to complete the cycle, to ensure that next year the fish will return again. For our sweet component of this chapter, let's talk about salal berries. These small, dark purple berries grow abundantly in the understory of coastal forests. Fresh, they're mildly sweet with a slightly mealy texture. But when dried or made into cakes, mashed and formed into blocks, then slowly dried in the smoky upper reaches of a longhouse, they become intensely concentrated, almost candy-like in their sweetness. Salal berry cakes were a trade commodity, valued by inland tribes who didn't have access to them. A single cake might be traded for furs, obsidian, or other goods. By the 1800s, European traders were also purchasing salal berry cakes, adding them to ships' provisions for their concentrated nutrition and long shelf life. Morning Mist's mother brings out a basket containing herring roe on kelp, our savory item for this chapter. This is a delicacy still prized in the Pacific Northwest today, though it's become increasingly rare and expensive. Here's how it's made. During herring spawning season, cedar boughs or kelp fronds are placed in shallow water. The herring lay their eggs on these surfaces, creating a thick, glistening layer of tiny orange roe. The branches or kelp are then harvested and dried, preserving the roe. The taste is oceanic, salty, with a pop-in-your-mouth texture and a richness that lingers on your tongue. It's eaten in small amounts, savored, each bite a reminder of the generosity of the sea. Now, for our unusual food, eulachon grease. Eulachon, also called candlefish, are small, oily fish that run up rivers in early spring. They're so fatty that when dried, they can actually be lit like candles, hence the name. But their primary use was oil production. Here's how it worked. Thousands of eulachon would be caught, placed in large wooden boxes or canoes, and left to partially decompose, yes, decompose, for several days. This process breaks down the tissues and releases the oil. The mixture is then heated, causing the oil to rise to the surface, where it's carefully skimmed off. The resulting grease is golden, translucent, and incredibly rich. Does this sound unappetizing? I understand if it does. But eulachon grease was so valuable that trade routes called grease trails crisscrossed the interior of British Columbia, carrying this precious commodity hundreds of miles inland. A single jar of eulachon grease could be worth a fortune in trade goods. For our final chapter, we're moving to the Great Plains, to the lands of the Lakota people. The year is approximately 1800, before the massive upheavals that would come with westward expansion, but already at a time of change. Horses, introduced by Spanish colonizers and then adopted and transformed into a central pillar of Plains culture, have fundamentally altered the way of life. But tonight, we're not focused on the dramatic, not on buffalo hunts or conflicts or the grand sweep of history. Instead, we're sitting with an elderly man, let's call him He Who Watches, outside a teepee on a clear autumn night. The sky is a bowl of stars, the Milky Way so bright it casts faint shadows. The air is cool but not cold, that perfect temperature where you need a blanket but don't need to huddle close to a fire. He Who Watches is teaching his grandson the star stories. Not astronomy in the Western scientific sense, but the stories embedded in the constellations, the narratives that help make sense of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. There, he says, pointing to a cluster of stars. That is where the buffalo live during summer. That's why we see more buffalo in winter. They've returned to earth from the sky pastures. The grandson, maybe 9 years old, peers up at the stars with an expression of complete absorption. This is education, but it doesn't feel like school. It feels like being let in on a secret, like joining a conversation that's been ongoing for generations. Before we get too deep into stargazing, let's talk about the food for this final chapter. For sweetness, there's chokecherry pudding, wojapi, as it's called in Lakota. Chokecherries are small, astringent fruits that are barely edible raw. But when cooked down with a little water and sweetener, traditionally, it would be prairie turnip flour or maple syrup from trade, they transform into something wonderful, thick, deep purple, tart-sweet, with a flavor that's like a wilder, more complex version of cherry pie filling. Wojapi was, and still is, a staple at gatherings and feasts. It's eaten on its own, used as a topping for fry bread, though fry bread wouldn't become common until later, when native peoples were forced onto reservations and given wheat and lard rations, or mixed with dried meat. By the late 1800s, when native peoples were forcibly confined to reservations, wojapi became a taste of freedom, a reminder of traditional foods gathered from the land. For our savory component, pemmican, the ultimate survival food. We've mentioned it before, but let's go deeper. Pemmican is made by pounding dried meat, usually buffalo or elk, into a fine powder, then mixing it with rendered fat and dried berries. The ratio is roughly equal parts meat powder and fat, with a smaller amount of berries for flavor and preservation. The result is incredibly calorie-dense, will last for years without refrigeration, and requires no cooking to eat. Lewis and Clark survived on pemmican during parts of their expedition, provided by native guides, and Arctic explorers in the 1900s relied on it. It doesn't taste like much. Imagine a very concentrated meatberry energy bar, but it's pure fuel. He who watches has a leather pouch of pemmican beside him, and he offers a piece to his grandson, who chews thoughtfully while continuing to gaze at the stars. There's something meditative about this scene, the slow chewing, the vast sky, the quiet teaching. Now, for our unusual food, one that might make you smile. Timpsila, or prairie turnip. This root vegetable was so important to Plains peoples that entire harvesting seasons were built around it. Women would use specialized digging sticks to harvest the turnips, carefully leaving some in the ground to ensure future crops. Fresh prairie turnips taste like, well, imagine a turnip crossed with a carrot, with a slightly peppery aftertaste. Not remarkable, but when braided and dried, they become intensely sweet and can be stored indefinitely. Rehydrated, they add a sweet, starchy element to stews. Ground into flour, they can be used as a thickener or mixed with berries. Here's the detail that might surprise you. Prairie turnips were so valuable that certain areas were considered the property of specific families or clans. Not in the European sense of land ownership, but in terms of stewardship and harvest rights. If you wanted to dig turnips in someone else's traditional area, you needed permission. This system prevented overharvesting and ensured sustainability, a practice that worked for thousands of years until it was disrupted by colonization and the reservation system. For our final chapter, we're moving to the Great Plains, to the lands of the Lakota people. The year is approximately 1800, before the massive upheavals that would come with westward expansion, but already at a time of change. Horses, introduced by Spanish colonizers and then adopted and transformed into a central pillar of Plains culture, have fundamentally altered the way of life. But tonight, we're not focused on the dramatic, not on buffalo hunts or conflicts or the grand sweep of history. Instead, we're sitting with an elderly man, let's call him he who watches, outside a teepee on a clear autumn night. The sky is a bowl of stars, the Milky Way so bright it casts faint shadows. The air is cool but not cold, that perfect temperature where you need a blanket but don't need to huddle close to a fire. He who watches is teaching his grandson the star stories. Not astronomy in the Western scientific sense, but the stories embedded in the constellations, the narratives that help make sense of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. There, he says, pointing to a cluster of stars. That is where the buffalo live during summer. That's why we see more buffalo in winter. They've returned to Earth from the sky pastures. The grandson, maybe 9 years old, peers up at the stars with an expression of complete absorption. This is education, but it doesn't feel like school. It feels like being let in on a secret, like joining a conversation that's been ongoing for generations. Before we get too deep into stargazing, let's talk about the food for this final chapter. For sweetness, there's chokecherry pudding, wojapi, as it's called in Lakota. Chokecherries are small, astringent fruits that are barely edible raw. But when cooked down with a little water and sweetener, traditionally, it would be prairie turnip flour or maple syrup from trade, they transform into something wonderful, thick, deep purple, tart-sweet, with a flavor that's like a wilder, more complex version of cherry pie filling. Wojapi was, and still is, a staple at gatherings and feasts. It's eaten on its own, used as a topping for fry bread, though fry bread wouldn't become common until later, when native peoples were forced onto reservations and given wheat and lard rations, or mixed with dried meat. By the late 1800s, when native peoples were forcibly confined to reservations, wojapi became a taste of freedom, a reminder of traditional foods gathered from the land. For our savory component, pemmican, the ultimate survival food. We've mentioned it before, but let's go deeper. Pemmican is made by pounding dried meat, usually buffalo or elk, into a fine powder, then mixing it with rendered fat and dried berries. The ratio is roughly equal parts meat powder and fat, with a smaller amount of berries for flavor and preservation. The result is incredibly calorie-dense, will last for years without refrigeration, and requires no cooking to eat. Lewis and Clark survived on pemmican during parts of their expedition, provided by native guides, and Arctic explorers in the 1900s relied on it. It doesn't taste like much. Imagine a very concentrated meatberry energy bar, but it's pure fuel. He who watches has a leather pouch of pemmican beside him, and he offers a piece to his grandson, who chews thoughtfully while continuing to gaze at the stars. There's something meditative about this scene, the slow chewing, the vast sky, the quiet teaching. Now, for our unusual food, one that might make you smile. Timpsila, or prairie turnip. This root vegetable was so important to plains peoples that entire harvesting seasons were built around it. Women would use specialized digging sticks to harvest the turnips, carefully leaving some in the ground to ensure future crops. Fresh prairie turnips taste like, well, imagine a turnip crossed with a carrot, with a slightly peppery aftertaste. Not remarkable, but when braided and dried, they become intensely sweet and can be stored indefinitely. Rehydrated, they add a sweet, starchy element to stews. Ground into flour, they can be used as a thickener or mixed with berries. Here's the detail that might surprise you. Prairie turnips were so valuable that certain areas were considered the property of specific families or clans. Not in the European sense of land ownership, but in terms of stewardship and harvest rights. If you wanted to dig turnips in someone else's traditional area, you needed permission. This system prevented overharvesting and ensured sustainability, a practice that worked for thousands of years until it was disrupted by colonization and the reservation system. He who watches finishes his piece of pemmican and brushes his hands together, then wraps his blanket more snugly around his shoulders. The night has grown colder, the temperature dropping as the earth releases the day's warmth into the clear sky. "Do you know why we tell these stories?" he asks his grandson. The boy shakes his head. "So you remember. So that when I'm gone, and you're the elder, you can sit with your grandson and point to those same stars and tell him the same stories. And he'll know that his grandfather's grandfather sat right here, looking at these same stars, thinking these same thoughts." There's something profoundly moving about this idea that the stars, unchanging, serve as a bridge across time. That the stories told tonight have been told for hundreds or thousands of years, and will be told for hundreds or thousands more, if we're careful, if we listen, if we remember. The grandson is quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he asks, "Will you teach me all the stories?" "As many as I can," he who watches replies. "The rest you'll have to learn from the living." Stories aren't meant to be stored up like dried meat. They're meant to be shared, passed around, kept alive through the telling. As the night deepens, a meteor streaks across the sky, a brief, brilliant line of light that's gone almost before you register it. The grandson gasps softly. "A star falling to earth," he who watches says. "Someone is being born, or someone is dying, or perhaps it's just the sky reminding us to pay attention, that beauty is fleeting and we must notice it while we can." They sit in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. In the distance, a coyote yips, not the lonely, mournful howl you hear in movies, but a series of excited yaps and yips, probably a pack reuniting after a hunt. The sound is strangely cheerful, almost playful. Eventually, the cold becomes too much, and they retreat inside the teepee, where a small fire burns in the center, its smoke venting through the opening at the top. The interior is warm, cozy, painted with geometric designs and pictographs that tell their own stories. The grandson settles onto a buffalo robe and pulls a blanket over himself. He's not quite ready to sleep yet. His mind is still full of stars and stories, but his body is beginning to make its demands. His eyes are heavy. His breathing has slowed. He who watches sits by the fire, feeding it small sticks, keeping it alive but not building it up. This is the grandfather's favorite time of night. When the work is done, when the family is safe and warm, when there's nothing left to do but sit and think and tend the fire. He thinks about all the changes he's seen in his life. The arrival of horses, which transformed Plains life from walking and dog travois travel to mounted mobility. The increasing presence of European traders, bringing metal tools and cloth and guns, but also bringing diseases and disruption. The sense that the world is shifting, that the old ways, while still strong, still vital, are facing challenges unlike any his ancestors dealt with. But in this moment, in this teepee, with his grandson breathing softly nearby and the fire crackling and the stars wheeling overhead, the old ways feel eternal, feel unshakable, feel like something that will endure no matter what changes come. And perhaps that's the real lesson of these quiet traditions we've explored together tonight. Not the dramatic moments, not the conflicts or conquests, but these small, repeated rituals. The preparation of food, the telling of stories, the passing of knowledge, the gratitude for what the earth provides, the recognition that we're part of something larger than ourselves, connected backward through time to our ancestors and forward through time to those not yet born. Your own connection to these stories is part of that chain now. You've listened. You've imagined. You've traveled through time and space to sit beside fires in longhouses and cliff dwellings and teepees, to taste foods both familiar and strange, to witness the quiet beauty of ordinary life lived with intention. As he who watches finally banks the fire and settles onto his own sleeping robe, as his grandson's breathing shifts into the steady rhythm of deep sleep, as the night deepens around the teepee and the stars continue their eternal dance overhead, I want to thank you for taking this gentle journey through history with me. And so, friends, we've reached the end of our quiet travels through the traditions of Native American tribes. We've sat beside fires in forest longhouses, desert cliff dwellings, and prairie teepees. We've tasted corn cakes sweetened with maple syrup, smoked eel, roasted puffballs, prickly pear, Yulican grease, wojapi, and prairie turnips. We've watched stars, woven baskets, prepared ceremonial feasts, and listened to stories older than written history. These weren't the dramatic moments that usually make it into history books. There were no battles, no famous names, no dates to memorize. Just the slow, steady rhythm of life lived in harmony with the land. Just people gathering food, sharing meals, passing knowledge to the next generation, finding meaning in repetition and ritual. I hope these stories have helped you unwind. I hope they've given your busy mind something gentle to hold on to as you drift towards sleep. I hope they've reminded you, as they remind me, that the most important parts of life are often the quietest. The everyday moments of connection and care. The simple act of noticing, of being present, of gratitude. Your breathing is slow now. Deep and even. Your body has released its tensions. Your thoughts have softened into something dreamlike. You're right on the edge of sleep, or perhaps you've already crossed over, letting my words fade into the background as your own dreams begin. If you drifted into peaceful sleep during the story, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Let me know which chapter was your favorite, which food surprised you, which tradition resonated most deeply. And if you're still here, still listening, still gently floating in that space between waking and dreaming, I'll leave you with this final thought. History isn't just the grand events and famous figures. History is also the fire that was tended every evening, the corn that was planted every spring, the stories that were told every night, the hands that wove baskets and prepared meals and pointed out constellations, the quiet, persistent, beautiful act of living. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for traveling through this small corner of history with me. Sweet dreams, friends. Until we meet again, good night.